Welcome into the next section of period number 4. This is topic 4.5, titled Market Revolution Industrialization. So, we're going to start talking about how the United States transitions from this agricultural or agrarian economy into a more industrialized and urban economy. If we remember the Jeffersonian Republic and the Democratic Republicans were interested in creating a society of safe, secure, stable farmers. So, we will talk about what changed and how the United States transitioned into this industrial powerhouse. So, your learning objective in this section is to explain the causes and effects of the innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce over time. So, by the end of this, you should be able to see how those innovations, how those inventions, how those changes caused change in society over time. So, let's get started. So, as with anything, it's important that we start with getting a look at some context. What were we like before? How did we get here? So, let's go back to the colonial period, pre independence. And in that period, you had household manufacturing, or what some would consider to be cottage industries. And cottage industry was almost universal in the colonial era. Under the British, the colonists really depended on the British for more refined and manufactured goods, like things that were made from raw materials. But a lot of people in the colonial era also made some things at home, whether that be small items, but it was really, really small scale. After the revolution, and post independence, it's you have the absence of British rule, so you're not really getting a lot of that manufactured goods from them. You have this spirit of nationalism, which we've talked about. So you begin to see the development of more local industry. And it again starts with the cottage industry, it starts with that household manufacturing, and then transitions into something more large scale. Okay. And the Americans are very eager to match the progress that the British manufacturers have. So you see states, individual states begin to offer what we called, or what were called, bounties. You might consider that to be rewards. Bounties kind of has a different meaning these days, but rewards to anyone who would be able to introduce new machinery and new industrial methods into America, new production methods into America. So that's kind of the context for what we see in this period of industrialization. So, as you see in this post revolutionary period, we're still kind of thinking about some context. How did we transition? How do we begin to make that transition from that cottage industry? How did we take that desire to match the British? And then how did we turn that into industrialization? Well, the one man who is sort of credited with kind of beginning that process is Samuel Slater. He is credited with building the very first successful factory in the United States, built in Rhode Island. Samuel Slater was a mechanic who was born in England, and he immigrated to the United States. He kind of slipped out of England in 1789, comes to America, and he has the plans for a British factory, a British textile factory, in his head, committed to memory. It was illegal at this point to take any plans for factories, take any machines with you if you left Britain. It was illegal at this point to take that abroad. Now, he comes to America in 1789, sets up shop in Rhode Island, builds this factory along a river, using the river and its movement to create motion to power the machines, right? We didn't have electricity like we do now. We didn't have the steam engine quite yet. So he uses the river's natural current, natural flow to power the factory. And that begins production in 1790. So, from one successful factory in 1790, by 1815, the United States has 213 factories, right? His idea, Samuel Slater's idea for a factory, spreads like wildfire, and it's imitated by a lot of others. So, we go from one to 213 factories in the US in just a matter of 30, what is that, 35 years. So this is seen as kind of the dawn of factory production in the United States. Now, before long, you have another entrepreneur, Francis Cabot Lowell, who comes to the United States from Great Britain as well, who brings more efficient technology. So we have the textile factories here in the United States, which are powered by the flow of a river. Now we see the introduction of new technology in something called the power loom, which was brought into the United States and actually smuggled into the United States. Very illegal for Francis Cabot Lowell to bring this in. He smuggles this technology into the United States from Great Britain and builds what become called Lowell mills, and they were revolutionary. Their concentration was on mass production and standardization, things that we really utilize in industry today, when we make things even today around the world. So for labor, he recruits young farm women. He houses them in company dorms so they don't have to go anywhere. They don't have to find housing. Remember, they're coming from the countryside. They're coming from these agricultural farms into more urban settings, into cities. People wanted them to be safe. So he knew he could take care of everything, house them. And other factories soon begin using this model as well. These become Lowell style mills. So, again, the introduction of this technology by Francis Cabot Lowell will start to see another small boom and another spread of technology that is really going to power industrialization in the United States. So, as we kind of round out the context here, we started in around 1789, 1790, all the way through now here at 1820. In the 1820s, New England kind of emerges as the country's leading manufacturing center. And again, I want you to kind of pair this with some of the things that we've talked about previously. When we were talking about some of the issues that had come up, and you had the Federalists who kind of gathered together, the New England Federalists who gathered together to sort of secede from the Union and form their New England Confederacy or their Northeastern Confederacy. This is part of the reason they feel that they are industrializing, they are producing, they are manufacturing the things that this country needs. But the reason why New England is so successful at industrializing is because it has a lot of water power. Most of these, and again, just to reiterate, we didn't have electricity, we didn't have the steam engines that we have later on, and we'll touch on some of those things. But we didn't have those. So you needed rivers, you needed the flow of water to power a wheel, to power and essentially give mechanical energy into the factory. And that there's a lot of rivers in New England, so it is abundant in resource here. So here by the end of the 1820s, or right around the 1820s, New England and overall the United States sees itself in a period of revolution, a market revolution in this case. So this is considered to be sort of the first industrial revolution in the United States. So now that we have some of the ideas and some of the context, we'll take a look at some of the individual technology and some of the individual innovations that kind of led the way for that revolution. So, like I said, we're going to get started taking a look at some of the individual inventions, some of the individual people, and some of the individual items and innovations that sort of lead the way in building up this industrialized economy in the United States. So let's dive right in and start talking about a few of those things. So this gentleman, I want you to remember his name. His name is Eli Whitney. We will talk about him again here in this unit. And here we're going to discuss his innovation of the system of interchangeable parts. Eli Whitney created this system to more efficiently make rifles. And what this did, it allowed for more mass production of certain pieces and certain parts that could then be used to assemble rifles. And it allowed people who were not very skilled at making rifles or not very skilled at making anything really to produce large numbers of rifles and weapons pretty quickly and at much lower costs. Plus, the benefit here was then that if something were to break down or need replacing, it was easy to find a replacement, and you didn't need to make an entirely new rifle. You could just interchange a part for one that was very similar or alike, right? So this system was eventually, the subsequent result of that system was it became the basis for lots of other mass production methods in factories, and would give rise to later on the assembly line, which we'll talk about when we start talking about Henry Ford. We'll talk about again the assembly line later, but it really gets its start here in 1801 with Eli Whitney and the system of interchangeable parts. The next bit of machinery that we discuss here is the sewing machine. So, what you should notice as well here in the beginning is a lot of the interest in manufacturing stems from weaponry, rifles, and textiles. Those are the things people need, and those are the things people want. So, in 1846, you had the invention or the innovation, the creation of the sewing machine. So, you have in 1846 Elias Howe, who is from Massachusetts, and he constructs the sewing machine. Now, another gentleman comes along, Isaac Singer, and he makes improvements to that machine. In fact, Singer is still around today. And if you have a parent or maybe yourself, you have a sewing machine at home, it might be a Singer sewing machine. Now, later, as he made improvements and they worked together on that, the Howe Singer machine was soon used to manufacture what was called ready to wear clothing. You didn't need to go to a seamstress, you didn't need to go to uh, someone to actually sew and put together a shirt. You could go to the store and buy a shirt that was ready made and ready for you to wear the moment you bought it. You could take it out of the store and go home and wear the shirt that day. It didn't need to be something that you placed an order for and someone made for you. That was more the style of the cottage industry, of the homemade items. You would go to a woman, a seamstress, and she would make a shirt for you after taking your measurements. Here, we had ready to wear clothing. So this is in 1846, mid 1800s. Now, here's Eli Whitney again. We've talked about machinery, but the system of interchangeable parts was not the first thing that Eli Whitney invented or innovated. His first, probably most significant innovation and invention was the cotton gin, which he invented in 1793. Now, cotton, when you pick the cotton from the field, you have to separate the fibers from the seeds, from the leaves, from the stems, right? From all of that. And now this is typically in the South, and this is work done by enslaved people, enslaved Africans in the South. So with this invention, the cotton gin allowed them to much more easily separate the seeds from the cotton fibers, which made them of better quality, and it was much easier work, and it transformed Southern agriculture. So it is a significant invention from Eli Whitney, and it made the work of the enslaved people much easier in reality. Now they could clean 50 pounds of cotton, and I don't want to say easier to make it seem better in any way, or their conditions any better, but the work itself of cleaning the fibers was a lot more efficient. They could clean 50 pounds of cotton in a day compared to being able to only really do around a pound a day before. So it improved production, increased production of Southern cotton, and now made it much more efficient. So we can use the cotton gin here to take a look at cause and effect in a bit of a small scale. The South is able to increase its production of cotton, which then increases the demand for enslaved labor. So they can produce much, much more. But partner that with the growth of textile factories who have also a demand for those cotton fibers. They can take those cotton fibers, excuse me, and turn those into fabrics and turn those into clothes. But take a look at how much growth there is in the cotton industry, in the southern cotton industry. As a percentage of exports, in 1800, cotton made up just about 7% of exports from the United States. By 1820, about a third of all exports from the United States are cotton, the raw material of cotton. And then by 1840, over half, 52% of American exports. So there's not only a demand for these cotton fibers in New England with the growth of the textile industry, but there is also demand around the world, particularly in Europe, particularly in Britain, where they also want this cotton so that they can also use it in their textile factories. So this causes this innovation, the cotton gin, caused a growth in production, caused a growth in cotton as a percentage of exports, and it resulted in a growth in demand for enslaved African labor in the South. So we'll move on from agriculture and we'll take a look here at communication. Now, again, remember the period that we're talking about, the early 1800s. The most efficient and probably the only way to communicate with anyone who lived outside of your city was to write a letter on a piece of paper, hand it to someone who would then ride either on horseback or on coach and would carry this letter for you and then try to deliver it, right? The early postal service. Now, then along comes Samuel Morse. And in 1832, he developed something called the Morse code. Now, we start to have electricity here, the electric current. Um, and what he did was he created a machine, the telegraph we'll talk about in just a bit, the machine in the background here. And what that did was it used short and long bursts of electrical current to represent individual letters. So you would have someone write the message down on paper and then have someone sit down and tap out the message on this machine. And then that would be received by someone else on the other end. So we'll talk a little bit more about the telegraph. But here, 1832, Samuel Morse kind of develops this code to represent letters and allow for much better, more efficient communication. So, partner the invention of the Morse code with the telegraph machine that you saw in the background of the last slide here, and then pair that with this new system. So, we had this invention and we're going to take it and how do we use it? And to do that, we developed a telegraph system, which was a system of wires that would zigzag between cities and towns. Here you see an image of two men putting up these posts to then string wire across that would take the telegraph to the west. And behind the words here on the screen is a man riding a horse. This is the Pony Express. So, again, the only way before to get a letter from, say, someone in Missouri or Iowa to someone who lived in California at the time was to hand it to a man who would then ride his horse across to the west and across to California and ultimately deliver that letter to California. It took months in some cases. So the telegraph wire would then be installed, and you pair this with the Morse code. This allowed messages to be transmitted in minutes using electricity. So this transforms communication. Between the 1830s and the 1860s, you have 50,000 miles of telegraph wire that would eventually connect the country. Think of this as the very early system for the telephone, which would be coming later, and then other forms of communication that you see today. It all gets its start here with the telegraph in the 1830s. So we move on from communication to probably the most important innovation in this period, which is the development of the steam engine. Now, initially, I told you earlier, we used river water and the flow of rivers to power factories. It isn't until a little bit later that we see the steam engine used for that. But here in 1804, you have both English and American inventors experimenting with steam engines for pushing and propelling vehicles over land. In fact, in 1802, the image you see in the background here, you have John Stevens, who runs a very small locomotive car around a circular track at his home in New Jersey. His invention, his use of steam to propel this car, then called for the development of locomotives and trains. And this would eventually give rise, look at the cause and effect here, give rise to the transportation revolution. So, again, looking at cause and effect, looking at causation, what was the cause of the transportation revolution? What's the development of the steam engine? So now we'll take a look at what the effect of that revolution is, right? What was the initiating cause? John Stevens developing this steam engine to propel the locomotive. And what was the result? So that's what we'll get into here as we start to take a look at transportation. So I don't want you to think of these developments and these innovations as something as things that exist in isolation, right? We don't have Samuel Morse just developing the Morse code and the telegraph all by himself for no reason. We don't have Eli Whitney developing the cotton gin for no reason. We don't see the developments of the textile industry and in interchangeable parts for no reason. They all kind of pair together here. And the increase in cotton production in the South gives rise to the need for increased textile production in the Northeast. And that increased textile production gives rise to a need for further demand for cotton from the South. Now there's also a need to communicate with people from the Northeast to the South, or from the East Coast to the West Coast. There's a need there. So these all kind of pair together. And now we're going to see how transportation fits into that. There's a need to move things and move people from one place to the other. So then we'll start talking about the transportation revolution. So first, let's talk about steamships. In 1807, you have an engineer by the name of Robert Fulton, who takes a ship called the Clermont, the very first steamship that travels upriver, make the trip from New York City to Albany, New York in just over 32 hours, traveling at about 5 miles per hour. Very rudimentary technology, but again, the very first attempt at using this new technology of the steam engine to propel not just a land vehicle here, but a ship that would go on the water. And that is a huge technological development, and it catches on particularly in the West. By 1830, you have about 200 steamships all along the Mississippi River, carrying cargo, carrying passengers, and you see the charges for using the railroads drop. This is what we call freight charges, and this pushes the Northwest places at the time. And when we say here Northwest, we're talking about places like Wisconsin, Illinois, um, those kinds of areas. It thrusts the Northwest into the national economy as well. So we, again, now we're starting to see the spread of the effects of industrialization. So let's talk a little bit more about what the effect of these steamships then led to, which is the development of the canal system. So by 1816, you have only about 100 miles of canals. And canals, I'm sure most of us have seen canals, but canals are man made rivers that exist in the United States. The longest canal around 1816 was about 28 miles long. Now, the Erie Canal would change that, and that was headed by the mayor of New York City at the time, Mayor DeWitt Clinton, and that would completely change that. So between 1816 and 1825, the Erie Canal was completed, and it was 363 miles long, and it connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. And you can see it on the map there, and you can find the Hudson River there on the map. It connected the Hudson River to a small lake in the center part of New York, and then connected that lake to the much larger Lake Erie, which is what gives the canal its name. So the Erie Canal is still in use today, by the way, but that was completed in 1825, and you see that sort of triple the amount of canals in the United States, from about 100 miles to completing a 363-mile long canal. And this would change the game when it comes to industrialization, especially in New York. Now, the Erie Canal was an immediate success. It initially cost around $7 million to build, but that cost was recovered in no time, really quickly. And ultimately, the effect of the Erie Canal was a boom all across New York, especially in Western New York, a rise in prosperity in Western New York, and cities and farm towns all across New York, because Western New York farmers had access now to much easier transportation of their goods to the urban centers and the industrial centers in New York, in and around New York City. So it provided a market for those farmers to sell their goods in the East. And the Erie Canal project gave rise to more canals, right? Once people saw how successful this canal project was, in just 15 years, you would see around 3,000 miles of canals built across the United States. And they all had similar effects on the economies in and around their regions. So, a huge boom in building canals and using water as a means for transportation. These canals would become known as the first real highway system in America. We didn't have highways at the time. Today, you would see these things travel down the expressway or down the interstate. We didn't have those at the time. So these really became the first true interstate highways of the United States. But unfortunately for canals, their success was very short lived, and railroads would gradually kind of replace them and all other forms of transportation. In fact, you see one of the first examples of that here. And this was to show people how successful railroads were compared to the original transportation systems that were around, the other forms of transportation, which is a horse pulling a carriage. It was much, much more successful than that. So in around 1840, you have around 3,000 miles of track, of railroad track. Then, as we start to see the innovations and developments in railroads, by around 1860, it's around 27,000 miles, but most of this is in the Northeast. And this becomes particularly a sticking point as we get towards the Civil War here. Most of the investment in transportation, most of the investment in these developments starts to go to the industrial centers, starts to go to the North and the Northeast in particular, particularly New England. And this will be something that we talk about again down the road when we get to the Civil War. So, again, some of these things it's important to keep in mind as we move forward in the timeline here. Now, these series of maps here is really just to show how rapid the development of railroads were. So, the first map on the far left of the screen is the amount of railroads in 1830. And you can really see that there's not a lot in around 1830. By 1840, we've got around that 3,000 miles of track, and you see mostly out of New York, in and around Maryland, DC, Philadelphia, New Jersey, right? That's where it is. You see a little bit in the South, but not as much. And then by the time we get to 1850 and 1860, you can see just how much that network of railroads has grown. And it would grow even more all the way up until the Civil War. Once the Civil War starts, there's no further investment in the South until the end of the Civil War. But we'll get to the Civil War and the 1860s a little bit later on. But look at how quickly the development of the railroad happens. And again, you can see very specifically, it's particularly in the North and then the Northeast, places like Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, all throughout the Northeast. That is where the development and the investment in railroads is. And it's understandable. That's where the industry is. That's the people who need to transport their goods and services from one place to another much more quickly and much more efficiently. So it makes sense that the investment goes there. It would become a sticking point later on in the Civil War, and that's something we'll talk about as we get there. But I just wanted to highlight just how quickly this development happens. Now, lastly, I just want to talk about the role that the government played in the development of transportation across the country. So let's dive into what the government's role was here. Now, the national government and the state governments were very active in kind of facilitating this transportation revolution. A lot of the road construction that happened, now we didn't have highways, we didn't have interstate highways and things like that. We had big roads, national roads. Some of those are still around today, but a lot of that construction, a lot of those improvements were funded through partnerships between public companies and, public governments and private companies. And that's still pretty much the case of how things are done today. But that is the role that the government played here. It really put forth the money and the investment. And then you had these private companies come in and do the actual work itself for benefit. For example, with railroads, and we'll talk about this later as we start talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, the only way that the companies would do the work is if the government also granted them land around the railroad. So we'll talk about how that works. But that is the way that the system still works today. You have these companies, these private companies who will do the work. The government will fund it and pay for it and maybe do other benefits as well. Now, at the same time, America starts to become really protective. And something we talked about in earlier sections in this unit were the protective tariffs that are passed. You see a series of protective tariffs that are passed in 1816, 1824, and 1828. And that was really to help the emerging American businesses compete more effectively with the British. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. Remember, we talked about earlier some of the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act and things of that nature, which really hurt American economy and American exports. So you have to see there be some sort of balance to protect industries here while still allowing and facilitating exports out of the country to really boost the industries. But again, here in the beginning, 1816, 1824, 1828, we see those series of protective tariffs to help the building of that industry happen and compete more effectively with the British. It's not a perfect system, doesn't work as well as some hoped it would, and we've touched on some of those things earlier on in earlier sections in this unit. But again, it's important to understand that these developments don't happen independently of each other, right? And this is the role that the government took. It took this role of taxing imports, right? Protective tariffs to help the industry develop, and then also then develop the network of transportation. So that is the role the government is taking on here. Now, in this early period, some of those protective tariffs did work, and the investment that the government made really paid off. The improvements in transportation, the improvements in technology, all grew northern manufacturing and then would ultimately grow shipping industries. We put the steam engines to use in other ships that would then travel across the world. So this promoted US commercial ties with the world that would grow over time. So this is where we start to see the US really establish itself as an industrial power, and eventually it would overtake the British economy and overtake the British industries and become the most powerful economy in the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that goes along here as well. But that will wrap up topic 4.5 here. I'll see you for the next section in this unit.